So last year, Dr. Uendo of SONICWARE launched his ELZ1 Play project. The ELZ1 Play was a successor to SONICWARE's first synthesizer, the ELZ1. It adds a lot of new features like more synth engines, built-in looper recorder, SD card storage, stereo speakers, velocity keys, and lots of other things. It was only available to backers, but those backers have now all received their ELZ1 Plays, so it's going to move on to being an official SONICWARE product, which will be available to buy from their store. There's also been a firmware upgrade that adds a number of features and fixes lots of bugs. So that's what this tutorial is about. I'm going to cover everything as best I can, just to give you a good grounding on how it all works. So let's get stuck in. So I've got them set up side by side here, just so we can have a quick look at the difference. This is the ELZ1 Play, obviously. You can see we've got a lot more control over different aspects of what's going on, because we've got more buttons on both sides. So this is to access different parts of the synth engine, and this is mostly for the looper and menus. We've got velocity sensitive keys. On the original we had a mono speaker, now we've got a stereo speaker which are built into the end cheeks. As you can see, the encoders on the original are a lot smaller. They feel much nicer on the new one too, more sort of chunky. The original obviously has white keys and this has black keys. That's because this is the black keys edition. There's also a white key edition too. So the buttons here give us access to different parts of the synth engine. We've got 5 encoders here that will be context sensitive depending on what's shown on the screen. We've got our looper controls here, octave buttons for the keyboard. We've got some access buttons here for the memory, pattern and loop, and then menu buttons here. So I'll just roll this over so we can have a look at the rear. We've got a volume control here for the speaker and the headphone output. We've got MIDI on DIN sockets, in and out. An auxiliary in for audio. We've got 2 full-size 1/4" output sockets for audio. We've got sync in and out for devices that support sync pulse. This is our SD card slot. This supports up to 32 gigabyte SD card. USB-C, we've got power here, which is 9-volt positive center. This is a match for the power supplies that you'll use with live-ons. It's also a match for power supplies you can buy for Korg Volkers, and here is our rocker power switch. Also on the back we have a battery compartment for 6 AA's. So with power connected, I'm just going to flick the power switch and we'll get a little boot up sequence. As soon as that's finished, we'll be able to test the internal speakers. So memory 0 is selected, the default patch, so we can just play it with the keys. It's a good patch to test the stereo width. You should be able to hear a nice stereo width through the internal speakers, which are also quite loud. But for the rest of the tutorial, just to get a clean recording, I'm going to turn the speaker down on the back and just put a couple of cables in our line outs. So that should now sound like this. So now we've booted up, let's just go over those controls quickly again. So this section here is all about the synthesizer and the mixer. So here at the end we've got our synth engine selection. If we go press this button, we've then got access to our volume envelope, our filter, an effects section, the settings, our sequencer, and our mixer. As you can see, each one of these pages has letters A to D that corresponds to these knobs. So for example, if I change this A, that will change the oscillator type on this preset. On this side, from left to right, we've got an up and down arrow. So as you can see, each of these has several pages, so we can scroll down and we get different selections for the knobs. We've got a menu button, which gives us access to all sorts of different settings. We've got the sound memory button, so that enables us to select different presets. As we'll see in a minute, we can go through, pick different sounds. The pattern selection will change whichever sequence we've got loaded. Our loop button loads different looper recordings, so we can make different 4-track looper recordings and save them to our SD card. Next to that is our plus and minus buttons. So with the loop selected, for example, we can press plus, that will load loop 1, and then loop 2, and obviously minus will take us backwards. Next to that is a save button, so if I wanted to save this loop, I could press the save button and press OK. So below the menu button we've got clear, which is for clearing selections and also backing out of menus, and then OK. We've got a mute button here, that's for controlling different parts of the looper. The pattern play button plays the sequence that we have loaded in here in our pattern. Next to that, we've got X and Y buttons. The use of these varies depending where we are in the system, but if we're just in our synthesizer section, we can use these as a bend. Up and down, and then we've got our metronome button, which gives us access to the tempo and metronome settings. At the bottom, we've got loops 1 to 4. These are used for selecting the different layers of the loop. So we've got 4 layers. We can use these buttons to arm them for recording and playing them back. The all button will play them all. Then we've got octave selection keys here, so we can transpose our keyboard, and the function button, which we hold to access certain functions. So unlike the Live in series, which links its patterns and its sounds, the sound memory, which is the synth preset, and the pattern are separate, as is the audio loop. So we can load a synth preset and a different pattern. We can swap them around as we like. So if we were to choose one of the patterns to play with this particular preset, so pattern 0, we press play. That's going to sound like that, but if we press pattern and advance to pattern 1, this will play differently. But it's still playing using this sound memory, this synth preset. So leaving that particular pattern on, we can change the sound memory. So press memory plus, and it will play a different sound. So the synth preset holds the synth engine type, envelope settings, filter, effects, and the voice settings for that patch. So that's all saved within a sound memory. Whereas the pattern saves the contents here with the steps in the sequence, and a loop saves the audio recordings that you've made on the 4 different looper tracks, but also the mixer. And then if we press X whilst in the mixer screen, actually we can see the loop settings per track are also saved in those memories. So those are all separate to each other. So there are 128 slots for our looper, so we can see we're on 0. If we go back from here, loop 127, so 128 slots for that. The same is true of our patterns, so we've got 128 slots. We've actually got 512 memories for our sounds, so if we hold the memory button, we can see the looper buttons light up. We're on bank 1. As we go through, we can select different banks. Banks 3 and 4 are empty when you get the machine, with banks 1 and 2 being full of presets. Alternatively to just using the plus and minus buttons, we can go into the menu here, so menu and memory, and we can see which preset we're on and what it's called. So we can select them from here with OK and OK again. And that changes our sound. As we can see, we've changed the preset here. Or if we want to scroll through quickly, we could hold the memory button and turn one of the knobs. You can see we've got yellow text at the top. Our selection won't change until we release our finger, and then when we do, it changes all the settings. So there are lots of presets you can use. Obviously, I don't want to go through all those because that'll take too long. But if you want to just jump in and make some music without making your own sounds, you can move to the sequencer and looper parts of the tutorial, which are later on. But for now, let's get stuck into some sound design stuff. So I could go into the menu and select the memory, press OK, OK again, and then initialize, but this will actually erase the preset from the system. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go into the third bank instead. So hold memory and press the looper button 3. That will take us to bank C, which, as I mentioned earlier, is empty. So we just got this sine tone with no effects or modulation or anything on it at all. So with the oscillator button selected, we can see our synth engine type, and then with the type knob, we can change it. So we've got low bit oscillator, which is like a kind of game console-esque oscillator. Standard oscillator, custom oscillator, which enables to change the shape of the two halves. Super oscillator, which layers lots of copies of the same waveform on top of each other. A few selections from the 8-bit warps. We've got a DNA Explorer and SiGrinder, which are both granular engines. A 4-op FM synth. Masked noise, which combines a wave form and noise to form its output. a sand flute, which uses noise and filters to create its output. Ztrings is a physical modeling string engine. And then lastly, there's a sample playback engine, which is designed to play drum sounds. If I just go back to the top, we can select the low bit oscillator. This just uses the first 3 controls on the first page. As we can see, the D knob won't do anything. A will change the bit depth of our waveform. As we can see, it's reflected in the visuals as well, and we can hear it too. We've got a wave. Got the oscillator shape on B with a few different selections. If we choose square, and then we've got duty. This will affect all the waveforms, but it's most audible on the square. Just going to pick a saw. So if we scroll down now, we can see that on the lower page, we've just got this mod type off, as we can see on A. From here, we can choose LFO or an envelope. This will add pages below. So if we choose LFO, assign that to the pitch, we can hear we've got a pitch LFO going on, which is a rapid vibrato. We can add some delay with the C knob, so it won't kick in until the delay is finished. We can change the shape on the D knob of the LFO to a few different selections. Scrolling down will take us to the rate and depth on A and B. The count determines how many times the LFO cycles, so infinite will just keep going as per normal. 1, it will just cycle once. Then we got, you can change that number there. The length control on D will chop the LFO up. So 1 will cycle the whole way through. As we change the selection, we'll use different parts of that LFO shape. Which can be really interesting. Scroll down again, we've got a phase. 0 goes up and down. 180 goes down and up. The tail will only really be useful in certain circumstances. So I'm just going to lengthen the release in the envelope page so we can hear it fading away. If we were to use that length control to change it and then give it a count of 1, we can hear it. At the moment it's holding wherever it decides it's going to finish. Whereas if we change this to original, it returns to the original pitch. So I'm just going to go back into that volume envelope and turn down the release. So we just get a nice short sound again. I'm going to go back into the oscillator and change the mod type, this time to envelope. So by default, it won't be doing very much. I'm going to assign that to pitch. It's going to sound a bit weird. So let's scroll through and just change these settings. So I'm going to change the attack. I'm going to change the decay. So we've got an up and down envelope. Let's bring that sustain down to 50%. Let's lengthen the release a little. And crank up the release again in here. There we go. Now we can hear what it's doing. So we've got an envelope with a bit of attack, a bit of decay, holding at 50%, and then a bit of release assigned to our pitch. So the depth is on A on the 3rd page, so we can alter it to make it more subtle or less subtle. We can add some delay in on the 2nd page with C, like we did with the LFO. And we can also invert it, so the direction the pitch will change will be opposite. So the LFO and envelope are available on all the different synth engines, but the assignments available will be different. So for this one, it's bit, oscillator type, duty, and pitch are our only selections. If we were to go to the next one along, let's go to the standard oscillator. This doesn't have the ability to change the bit depth, but we get a nice clean, bright output from our oscillators. We can go down and we can switch on the mod type, and we can see what assignments we've got. So oscillator type, duty, and pitch are the targets here. So this is even more simple actually than the first oscillator I showed. If we change that back to oscillator type though, we can hear it cycling through the different oscillators, which is quite an interesting effect just on its own. Also, if we want some classic pulse width modulation, select square, put this at 25%, and then change the assignment to duty. And lower the depth to 25.2, which is really rather nice. Let's go to the next one along. So custom oscillator enables us to stack two waveforms together. So by default we've got two sines, which will just sound like a sine wave oscillator. But if we were to change one of these, say with B, we're going to get a sine followed by a square. At the moment we've got the period set to 5, so we'll get 5 sines followed by 5 squares. And as we turn this up, we'll be able to clearly hear the difference between them. Whereas if it's nice and short, it starts to turn into a single oscillator sound. So you can get lots of variation with this. We've got duty here too, which affects all the oscillator types. And then scrolling down, we can assign our LFO to the oscillator types 1 and 2. The period for them, and duty and pitch. So next up is the super oscillator. This stacks 3 octave copies of the same waveform, including detune and noise. So the default sound sounds like this, which is made of sine waves. On the third page we can adjust the noise type and its level. I'm going to turn that off for now. Just go back to the first page and select a saw instead of a sine, which is immediately going to sound much bigger. So if I go to the second page, on B and D respectively, there's an octave up and an octave down compared to the root. So I can turn those down. So you're just about to hear the root note now. On page A we can adjust C to detune. And obviously on the A knob, as we showed before, we can change the waveform type. Got square, sine, triangle, and 2 different directions of saw. If we go back to the second page, we can add in that octave up on B. Detune that too. And add in the octave down. So like I say, great for pads if we were to lengthen the envelope a bit. We can do some interesting stuff. In the assignments for the LFO, we've got an oscillator type. We can target detune and level for the 3 different parts of the sound. We can target the noise type, the noise level, the overall pitch. And so those are our targets. Next up is the 8-bit wave memory synth. This enables us to draw our own wave shapes. So with the A knob set to memory, we can use the C and D knobs to move a cursor around. You can see it's moving backwards and forwards. A sine by default, but it's a very rough sounding sine because it's 8-bit. So we can change, say, the selection and move to the next one. And just keep going until we're happy with our sound. We can choose from a number of banks as well. These are saved on the system. So this is the one I'm editing, but by changing A, I can go through lots of different presets. And then we've got some that are blank after bank 26 up to 50. If I go back to the one I've edited right at the start under Mem, we can press Function and OK. We can save this into one of those banks. So if I press OK again, I can then choose where it wants to go. So I can go to, let's go to 50 just to make it really obvious where it's gone. Press OK. And now I've saved that. So we scroll through again to the end, and there's my creation. This is useful because some of the other synth engines use these waveforms as well, so we'll be able to load those in. The detune control on the first page is going to add detuned copies of that waveform too. On the second page there is a colour selection, so classic is going to be very rough with lots of bright aliasing, and modern just attempts to smooth a little bit of that out. There's not much difference, but it is there. Our only target is pitch on this synth engine. Our next selection is the 8-bit wave memory synth in morph mode. So we can select up to 3 waveforms here and morph backwards and forwards between them. So the default sound just has these 3 and is quite rapid. We can slow it down with the D knob. Which can do some quite interesting stuff. We can choose, if we want to move C to be nothing. So I'll skip back to A. So we can either have 2 or 3 waveforms going. We can choose with the A, B and C knobs the different waveforms. So we've got the same selections we saw before. And then we get into the blank banks. You should see on 50 will be mine. Then beyond that we've got some FM banks. These relate to the next synth engine. So there are lots of different ones here to choose from. If we scroll down, we've got the same detune and colour selections that we had before, and our mod type is pitch only again. Next up is the FM mode for the 8-bit wave memory synth. This uses 2 operators to create a new waveform. Don't worry if you don't understand FM synthesis, because it only really uses 2 knobs. With the A knob set to memory, we can edit the waveform, and then as we scroll through, we can see we've got waveforms that have already been saved and rendered down like we did before. We can use the detune control, like we did before, to add a detuned copy. But the interesting stuff really is on knobs C and D. So the higher the D knob, the brighter the waveform will become. And then we can get different tones by adjusting the C knob. It's capable of some really interesting stuff at lower octaves. Really dark and dirty things. So if we create a waveform again and we want to save it, we can press function and OK. It'll ask us if we want to save memory to bank, which we're going to do. Press OK, and then once again we can choose a slot to save this into. And then on some of the other 8-bit wave memory synths, we can use that waveform again. But I'm just going to back out of here. On the second page, we can choose once again between classic and modern colour. And then on the third page, we have a modulator slot like we did before, but there's actually a 4th and 5th page. We've got 3 modulators we can assign here. So let's just turn on one of the LFOs. We can set that to FM ratio. Then if we keep scrolling down, we've got the same options we had before, and then once we hit the second to last page, we've got a second modulator slot. So we could, for example, assign envelope to pitch. And then obviously we've got the same controls for that envelope. And then on the last page, we've got a 3rd modulator, so we can actually assign a lot of stuff to this one. Next up is the 8-bit wave memory synth in warp mode. This just combines 2 waveforms and we can crossfade between them. On the A knob, we can choose the waveform that's on the left, and on the B knob, we can choose the waveform on the right. So this default tone is a mixture of sine and saw, and we can see this represented in the waveform at the top. And as we crossfade between them, we can see that change. With the center being a 50-50 mix. And then we can change the waveforms. So we've got the same selections we did before. All the things that are saved into the different banks are here, and also the FM waveforms that we saw before at the end. So let's just stick to that default tone. We've got detune on D, as we did before. Next page down, we've got that classic and modern color we can choose between. And then we've got a modulator slot. So we can set this to crossfade if we want to. Change the rate and depth. Next up is something quite unique, and that is the 8-bit ADASR synth engine. This assigns different waveforms to different parts of the envelope. I will need to skip ahead just to get to the volume envelope here. we're going to change it to this selection, which adds in a 5th stage. So we can change the ADASR as normal with attack and decay. We've got the sustain section, but we've also got an extra section that kicks in after we release our finger. As you can hear, that's fading down and then back up again. So we can now see each part of this synth engine applies a different waveform to those 5 parts of the envelope. So when we hold our finger down, we end up on sustain. If I change the sustain waveform, you can hear we settle on a different tone. If I was to change the attack, so there's some really interesting stuff to do here. You get tones that I don't know how you'd be able to access from any other type of synthesizer, to be honest. So the first page is attack, decay, sustain, and then we've got the release attack section, and then on the second page we've got the release section, the bit that comes as the note fades away. We've got the same detune and color controls here too, and then we've got our mod type, which in this case is pitch only. Next up is the last of the 8-bit based engines. This enables us to select 3 waveforms and then flick between them instantly with a time gap between. So the default tone sounds like this, just going from sine to saw to triangle. So we'll sustain on the last selection. So A controls the first waveform, B controls the second waveform, and C controls the third waveform. On the second page, we can control the time it takes from getting from the first to the second. And the B knob, we can control how long it takes to get from the second, third waveform. We also have the detune and classic and modern controls here too. And then our modulator type is pitch only. So let's get stuck into the DNA Explorer. It's one of the granular engines on the unit. That means we can load a sample into this, and then we can play parts of that sample back in different ways. So there's a default sample loaded already. If we play and move the A knob, we can point this cursor at part of the waveform, and that's where it will play from. We've got this dig control. In the manual, it describes it as the extent of the waveform extraction. I think this is probably synonymous with grain size. We can add a harmony, which is we can turn up harmony, which adds in an octave. That's not too easy to hear at the moment until we make something a bit more interesting. And we've got a gain control as well that changes the volume of the output, just in case the particular place we're landing isn't very loud. So we go down, we can choose between waveforms on the internal memory and on the external card. We can choose the wave from here. So wave data 1 is the default, and then I've recorded something as well, which I'll demonstrate in a minute. We've got that classic and modern color control too. So one of the most interesting things we can do is to assign a modulator to the Explore control. So an LFO is going to do some interesting stuff. We keep playing around with where we're starting from. And that depth and time. We get some very interesting results. So there are 3 internal slots. These are 5-second long samples. I've already got something recorded into the second one, and the third one is empty. If we want to record our own waveform, all we need to do is plug in something into the external input on the back. So I've got another synthesizer here. I'm just going to plug it into the auxiliary in. And then we have to play a tone and hear it through the ELZ1 play. I'm going to press function and OK, and that will take us to a record mode. It'll record as soon as we press OK. And wait for it to finish. Then I can choose a slot to save it in. So wave data 1 is the standard waveform that comes with it. So I'm not going to save over that. I'm going to save over wave data 2, We always save to the internal memory, and then from the menu we can move these onto the SD card. So I'm going to back out of here. I'm going to go down to the second page and move wave selection to the second slot, which is going to show us a wave data 2, which we just made. So I'm going to get different results here. The gain one's turning up. So depending on the sample you use, you're going to get very different results, so it's just worth experimenting with. This sounds a bit more tonal than we did before, so we can now show what the harmony knob does. So just adds it in a copy an octave above. The next synth engine is called the SiGrinder, and it's similar. It's still a granular engine. We can go down to the second page and move the start and end points, so this determines which part of the waveform we're going to be using. And then the C knob will change the time. As it gets through that loop. We've got a gain again on D, if we want to make it a little bit louder. If we go back to the top, we can change the size of the chunks of the waveform it's chopping up with the A knob. This is the resolution. The higher this is, the smaller the chunks are. And then we've got the same dig control as well. We've got the same harmony control. We've also got a bit crusher here too. If you want things to sound a bit rougher with normal, heavy and destruction. Just going to leave that off for now. On page 3 you've got the same selection between internal, external, the waveform, the colour, but we've also got a direction. So up and down is default, but we can also set this to random. So that will just hop around. And then in the mod type again, we've got assignments for pitch, resolution, dig, harmony, and bit crush, start and end, and the time, and the gain. So we've got an awful lot of control here. So next up is the FM synth engine. This is a full 4-operator FM synth. I'm not going to get too bogged down in FM theory, because that's something I've done a lot on the channel before. But the first 4 pages control the operators. The 5th one allows us to select an algorithm. And also by turning the D knob, we can randomize the patch. But I'm just going to select algorithm 2. This sends operator 4 into 1 and also makes 2 and 3 audible as carriers. I'm going to make 2 and 3 mute by going to their respective pages and turning the B knob down. So that will mute operators 2 and 3. So we're just hearing operator 4 being fed into 1. If I go to page 4, we can tweak operator 4. So I can set its level here. This will determine how much it affects operator 1. Higher levels creating brighter tones. And we can determine how much it affects itself with the feedback knob, which is C. Again, creating brighter tones. And then the ratio will determine the tone. If we want to add a bit of movement to a sound, we can detune the operators too with the D knob. Just adds a little bit of wonk into the sound. One of the classic things we can do is control the level of operator 4 with a modulator. So we've got 4 slots for modulators on the FM synth. Personally, I like to use mod number 4 to control operator 4, just to make it a bit easier to understand. So let's turn on an envelope. I'm going to scroll through until we see 4 level. So this will make the envelope control operator 4's level. So let's just tweak in something. Turn the depth up. And then back off the level in the operator control so it's got somewhere to go. Now we can hear it's doing something. So we build FM tones by different combinations of the operators and are controlling their level over time. Next up is masked noise. This creates its output by masking noise using a waveform. So it's a combination of noise that we can choose with A and a waveform we can choose with B. And then the mask level is controlled by C. It's It's going to get louder and louder as we turn that mask level down. We can use one modulator targeting the noise type, the mask type, that being the waveform, the mask level and pitch. The next synth engine is the Sand Flute. This processes noise using filters. So there's 5 filter outputs that we can control. We've got a noise type on A. We can control the type of filter with B from bandpass, peak EQ, notch, and at the bottom there's also an off selection. I'm just going to leave that on bandpass. So at the moment it's kicking out all 5 outputs all equally. But if I change the C knob, that's the width of the output, things will become quite pure sounding. And then we can turn up the level of each of the outputs respectively. So these are spread an octave apart from each other. So we can turn up the fundamental. And then as we go through, we can, on page 2, we can adjust the level of the other 4. So just by using different combinations of different levels of the filter output, we can create some interesting stuff. On the modulation page, we've got one modulator we can apply to the noise type, the filter type, the bandwidth of the filter, and then each of the level of the 5 outputs. All level and then pitch. The next synth engine is Ztrings. This is a physical modeling string synthesizer. On the A knob, we can choose whether we want to use a noise impulse that comes from internal or external source. We can choose the noise type by using the B knob. Just going to make a subtle difference for sound. Going to stick to white. On the C knob, we can change the attack, which is the little click at the start. So turning that down will make it less obvious. At the top, it'd be more obvious. We can change the string type using D. Then on the second page, we've got a decay length, so how long it takes to fade. So at the top will be fairly long, at the bottom will be really short. We can change the oscillator type for the body of the instrument, so between sine, rectangle, saw and triangle. Then we've got a filter built in, which is part of the model on C and D, so filter frequency and resonance. It's going to make quite a big difference for sound. On the modulator page, we can choose to assign to the noise type that plucky attack, the cutoff for the impulse at the start of the note, how long the decay lasts for, the oscillator type for the body, the filter frequency and resonance. It's worth pointing out that even though the synth engine has its own decay control, it's also controlled by the ADASR envelope. So if you want to hear those long decays, you have to turn up the release in the ADASR too. The last of the synth engines is something a bit different. This uses the first 15 white notes on the keyboard to play drum samples. We can choose whether we want to load kits from the internal memory or external memory with A. I've got a card in with some stuff from the sample track on it, which is where the kits come from. If you haven't got a sample track though, you can still just use the 5 internal kits. So there's a cinematic kit, a reggaeton kit, a rock kit, a techno kit, and a sort of a gain kit. I'm going to pick the techno kit, which sounds like this. And then with the C knob, we can load a preset pattern into the sequencer. So if I just keep tweaking around until I find a techno rhythm that I like, and then hit play on the pattern play button, that plays that preset. If we just quickly click on the pattern button for a second, we can see the notes in the sequence here. But the sequencer is something I'll come back to a bit later. So on the second page down, we can tweak aspects of the sound. So if I go to the second page, pick the kick, for example, we can tweak the level using A, pitch, pan it around, and determine how much of it is sent to the internal effects, which won't be turned on at the moment. We can do this for every drum sound individually. So that's taken quite a long time, obviously, to get through all the different synth engine types. There's a lot to look at here. I've just gone back to the standard oscillator and set it to saw, and now we can press this button to get to the ADASR page. We've obviously looked at this a few times as we've gone along, but to cover it thoroughly, we can change the type with the type knob. So we've got a few different ones we can look at. Just going to stick to the standard ADASR at the moment. So we've got a single page with A being the attack, B for decay, C being the sustain, and D being the release. If we change the type, we get a different version of this. So the first page then becomes attack and the attack curve. So we can change the shape of the attack. And the same is true of decay. So we've got the time and the shape of the decay. We go down, the sustain level is the same on A, release time, and then the release curve. If we scroll over, the third type is what we showed earlier. So we've got an attack, a decay, a sustain. We've got a release attack section that we can alter the level with A on the second page. So that adds in a section that will play after we release our key. So that will fade in after the sustain, and then release on B on the second page. The final type is a combination of these. So we've got the attack curve, decay, and decay curve on the first page. The second page we've got the sustain, the release attack length, the release attack level, and then the curve for the release attack. On the third page we've got the release length and the release curve shape. So this is a really complicated envelope that we can really dig into and make some really interesting shapes. So the volume ADASR section is really as complicated as you need it to be. I'm just going to put that back on the standard type just so that we've got a normal ADASR envelope. So let's have a look at the filters. So the third button along the top takes us to our filter section. It's off by default. As you can see, we've got these cute little monsters sleeping to tell us that the filter's off. If we don't want such sort of cute representation of the filters, we can use function and OK to switch between that and graph. But I'm going to leave it on the monster view because I like it. So the type knob changes the filter type. So the first one is a 6 dB non-resonant low-pass filter. A changes the cutoff, with B controlling the gain. The next type along is a resonant 12 dB filter. So I can turn the resonance up with B knob. Sweep around. I'm just going to lower the octave of the keyboard so we can hear this a bit better. We can change the gain with C. We can get into some distortion internally here. So if we're hearing distortion, we don't want it. That's where we can turn this down. But if we want, we can make things really destructive. Applying modulators works the same as it does in the synth engines. So the second page down, we can choose a mod type. So this is LFO. It's assigned to the cutoff by default. So on the B knob, we can change the assignment between the frequency and the resonance. The shape of the LFO can be changed with the C knob. Rate is on D. Depth is on A on the next page. We've got the same count, length and phase that we can alter, and the same tail mode that we saw before. As we change the filter types, these assignments will need reassigning if we want them back. So the different filter types have different assignments. This is the non-resonant high-pass filter. We've got a resonant high-pass filter on the next selection. Again, with frequency, resonance, and gain respectively. We've got a bandpass filter here. We can alter the width of the filter. with B, and alter the gain with C. Which can do some interesting stuff. Things get a little bit more unusual with the peak EQ filter types. So as we sweep this around, you won't hear any difference until we alter the gain. So that just sweeps a resonant peak around. The gain can go into -2, so we can put a notch in. And again, we've got gain on the end. And D. The low EQ works similarly, but won't make any difference again until we up this gain. The gain will start to amplify the lower frequencies, and then the Q puts sort of a double peak in. So we've got some distortion here, so we can back that gain off. If we want to. Let's have a go with an envelope on this one. So envelope, we can change the depth with A on the third page. So we've got attack and decay on B and C, sustain on D, and on the last page we've got release on A. So this works the same way on all the different filter types. Let's keep going though. So there's a high EQ as well, which works similarly to the last one, which will amplify the high frequencies when we turn up the gain. And we can alter the Q. With the pre-gain again on D to trim if you don't want that distortion. Do some very interesting stuff. And lastly, we've got a notch. So I'll come back to filters when we come to build a bit of a demo patch. So I've turned the filter off again. Let's have a look at the effects section. That's the fourth button along on the top. So there are 4 different slots here. We can cycle through by going up and down. And each of these can have a different type of effect in them. And some of them overlap between vertical slots. I'm not going to cover absolutely everything here. Some of them have similar controls. So the first 3, overdrive, distortion, and fuzz, have basically the same controls. So fuzz has a gain on A with a tone control on B, and then the level is controlled by C. If we need to trim that volume down. Moving over, we've got a chorus, so we can change the rate with A, depth with B. The mix between wet and dry with the C knob. So dry is on the left hand side. And we have a BPM sync control that we can turn so that we can get the chorus to sync with the tempo. Which is quite cool. We've got a vibrato here, which is an interesting way of adding some more modulation if you've already used your modulation slots up in your oscillator. So rate on A, depth on B, and again we've got BPM sync here too, so we can have that vibrato linked to the tempo. And then the rate knob is disabled. We've got a phaser. Rate on A, we've got a stage control, which basically determines how rich the phaser will sound. You can invert the signal, which can have quite a drastic effect on the sound sometimes. And then the mix control, again, left hand side is dry, and on the right is maximum phaser. Tremolo works very similar to the vibrato. We've got a shape control on A. So this is controlling the volume up and down. So the rate on B, depth on C, and again BPM sync on the D knob, so we can get our tremolo to match the tempo. We've got a flanger. With a rate on A, depth on B, mix on C, and then the feedback control. So this sends some of the signal back into the flanger. Which is very good. Ring modulator, so this is an audio rate effect. We control the rate with B, depth with C, and the oscillator shape with A, which can produce some interesting stuff. And again, mix is controlled by D with dry B on one side and wet on the other. We've got an auto wire here. On A, we can change the filter type between low pass, high pass, band pass, and band reject filter. The sensitivity is controlled with B knob, and the depth on C. And again, we've got a resonance control for the filter on D. You may need to change the overall volume of the patch when you're using this because it has a tendency to make things a little bit quieter. After that, there's a bit crusher. We've got a mix between wet and dry on A, so I'm just going to max that out. We can change the bit depth selection here from off to 8-bit, 4-bit, and there's a 2-bit option as well. I'll just leave it on 8. We can also change the frequency. We've got a fine control for the frequency too. After the crusher, there's a 4-pole filter, which is new to version 1.1. So we've got lots of different filter types. Let's just stick to low pass for now. So frequency and resonance on B and C, with a gain control on D, which will only kick on some filter types. So if we try, say, the low shelf, we have to change the gain for this to have an effect, just like in the other filter section. And we can go both ways. So in all, we've got low pass, high pass, band pass, notch, low shelf and high shelf, and peak. Lastly, on the driver mod section at the top, there is a trim filter. Altering the gain here, we can sort of EQ our sound a bit with the low cut and high cut filters. And the gain control goes both ways. So on the next row down, we've got our modulation effects. Some of these will look very familiar. So the first thing we've got is a stereo chorus. So the controls are the same as the chorus, but this is stereo. We've got a vibrato, a phaser, tremolo, and flanger, which are all the same. But there's auto pan in here, which is new. So this will pan left and right depending on the shape we choose on A, and the rate on B, with depth on C. So if we change this shape, got quite a few options there, and then BPM sync again on D to match our tempo. We've got a ring modulator and auto wire here too, which are same as the top selections. Just going to turn that off. Oh, and the top one. So the third row down, we've got a delay and reverb selections. So as we go through, we've got a standard delay with a time control on A, BPM sync on B, so we can choose something that is relative to our tempo again. And then feedback on C, all the way up to 100%, which will just keep cycling. And we've got a mix control here too, so we can turn the level of the delay down. So when it's at 0, we won't hear it at all. We scroll over, we've got a tape echo, which is similar, but it's going to sound a bit different. So it's the same controls. So the delay is a little bit kind of muted because it's like emulating the way they record to tape. We've got a reverse delay, which is the third selection. Again, the controls are the same. This is not something you'll really be able to tell the difference unless we make a sound that is obviously kind of going in one direction. So let's kill the attack and turn the sustain down. So now we can hear this fades down, but the reverse delay has it coming back up again. We've got a ping pong delay, which will pan the delays from left to right. Again with the same controls. And Worth messing around with the time on these, by the way. Do some cool stuff. Next selection along is reverb. This is just a standard reverb with mix and decay. A bright reverb. So that's it for that row. So let's turn that off and go down to the reverb / master effects at the bottom. So there's a lot more reverbs in here. So the first room reverb has a mix and shimmer control. So 100% mix with shimmer. Shimmer adds in an octave above. The next one along is whole, and that has the same controls. Plate with the same controls. Now we've got a custom reverb, so we can change the pre-delay on A, which determines how long it takes for the reverb to come back at us. From nothing to 100. Decay is how long it takes the reverb to disappear. We've got high damp control here. If we open this up, it'll be bright. If we close it down, it'll be a lot more muted with a mix control on the end. We've got an arena reverb, which is the same controls as the ones we looked at earlier with the shimmer. So really big. And if we add shimmer in, really big with a bright tail. We've got a vinyl record effect, which adds in noise on B. Changes the bandwidth on A, flutter on B, and saturation on D. Let's just change the sustain a bit so we can hear this better. It's just designed to emulate a badly made record. Cassette tape is similar. So we've got a cutoff, which the higher we turn this up, the less high frequencies we can hear. Tape noise on B, flutter on C, and gain on D. We've got another bit crusher on the master effect, which is the same as the one we looked at earlier. We've got a tunnel reverb here with a very long tail and also shimmer control. We've got an infinity reverb with the same controls. And then we've got some ambient reverbs. These come from the ambient 0. So here we've got a low and high dampening control for the ambient room. When the balance control is set to 0, this plays the sound and the main body of the reverb. With it turned all the way up, it's just the reverb sound we're hearing. With all the way down, it's just the dry signal. And the same is true of the shimmer end. So if we turn this all the way up, we can hear lots of shimmer all the way down. With this down at 0, we just get the main body of the reverb. Then it's the same controls for ambient whole and ambient infinity. The shimmer control and our dampening controls. So that's all the effects covered. Let's take a look at the settings. So this is the settings for the voice that we saved into the voice memory. So far we've done everything in poly mode. So that enables us to play chords. If we want to change that, we can select mono or legato. These both allow just one note to be played at once, with new notes cutting off the old notes. We can change the note priority here, so the newest note will re-trigger when we've got it set to last. Regardless of where it is on the keyboard, we can change this to low, so only new low notes will re-trigger. Whereas if we do that the other way around, it won't do anything. And we can choose the same with high notes, so only new high notes will re-trigger. The other way around won't do anything. Just leave that on last if you find that confusing. So we've got glide time here too, so glide will create a little pitch glide between notes. If we go over to legato, it works the same, apart from it won't re-trigger the volume envelope with new notes. So you can hear that's just sitting on the sustain part of the envelope. Moving down, we've got a unison here. This is quite an interesting unison. We can turn on different unison voices up to 4 different parts. So turning on unison 1, as you can hear, that's actually adding in an octave. So that's unison 1. If we scroll over, we can set the tuning for unison part 1. If I set this to 0, that's just going to double it up. If we move over again, we can set the detune for unison 1. So if we tweaked each one of these, we could have like a classic kind of unison with big voices, or if we decided we wanted these set to 0 and then tweak the interval, we can set up chords. So we can use this like a chord mode too. So it's really quite flexible. I'm just going to go back to the on-off section, turn this off. So just to recap, we've got a section for switching one of 4 unison voices on and off, a section for setting their interval, and a section for setting their detune. Moving down, we've got an arpeggiator that we need to turn on with the type knob. So up, we'll play the notes that we held in sequence going upwards, and there's lots of different shapes for this if we keep going, with some adding in octaves. We've got a BPM sync on knob A that we can change again to match our tempo. There's also a time knob. If we have BPM sync turned off, that will affect it. And there's also a gate time here, which if we turn that right down and then go back to our envelope, you can hear the gate time kicking in there. Lastly, on the settings, we have a level for the patch, which we can adjust if we're getting distortion, or we just want to level the patch up compared to other sounds. We can do that from here. And using the type knob, we can get over to a tuning mode. So if we've got it set to global, that will match the global tune setting in the menu, whereas we can change it to this particular memory, and then we can detune this particular preset separately. So using what we've learned so far, let's make a patch. So I'm going to go to the voice mode. I'm going to change this to legato. So we're just getting that mono behavior we talked about before. A bit of gliding. I'm going to go down to the unison mode. I'm going to turn on unison 1 using A, scroll over using type, and set the interval to 7. So we should have a fifth. I'm going to go to my oscillator page and leave it on the standard oscillator. I'm going to change this to a square. I'm going to lower the duty down, and then I'm going to scroll to the bottom. On the mod type, I'm going to put an envelope on duty with no attack, a decay of about a second, maybe slightly less. I'm going to drop the octave down. Just going to shorten that release and attack. And in the filter section, I'll put on that low EQ filter. It sounded quite cool earlier on. So let's stick an envelope on here too. So envelope set to frequency. Going to turn the attack down, a bit of decay, lower the sustain, and up the depth. A little bit of release, and just tweak that frequency down a bit. Okay, that's maybe a bit much depth. Now we're getting somewhere. Really obnoxious bass. Maybe we should call it that. In the effects section, let's try something like... Yeah, the fuzz sounds good. Now let's try... stereo chorus, just with the default setting. So I like the ambient hole. Let's back that balance down a bit. It's kind of horrible, not going to lie. Let's save this down though. So I've got memory selected. I'm going to press the save button and we can choose a slot. So it's set to bank C 0. I'm just going to press OK. So if we decide we want to name that patch just so that we can see it on the screen, we can press the menu button, go into memory, and there we are in memory 0. Press OK, go down to rename. Then we can use the type knob to move the cursor around and the A knob to change the letters. So once we've entered the name, we can just press OK to execute, and then that patch will be named. This works the same for the patterns and the audio looper. So let's have a look at the built-in sequencer. I'm not going to use that particular patch that we just made to demo the sequencer because it won't really work very well. So I've just quickly made another one which just it's a sort of digital piano-esque tone with a bit of sustain in the middle. So if we press this button, we get to the sequencer screen. We need to select pattern if we want to change the pattern in the sequencer. We can press plus and minus here to change through 10 different built-in presets. I'll just let this one play because I like it. So with the sequencer screen selected on the top row, we can select the step we've got selected with A, and the type knob moves us across the notes visible on the screen. The part of the screen that's shown is tied to the current transposition octave of the keyboard. So if I go octave down, we can see the lower notes in the sequence, and transpose up, the upper notes appear. We can change the per step note length. So currently this is set to 8th. If I were to change this, the sequence is going to change speed as it plays, so 16ths will be twice as fast. We can change the length of the sequence on the C knob. We can turn this down and up. We can go all the way to 128 steps. This built-in sequence is 64 steps long. We can change the swing from here too. This changes the spacing between odd and even notes in the sequence. And the higher it goes, the more obvious it is. Moving down to the second page, we can select the step again. So on each page we can use type to move left and right, and the A knob to move up and down. Here we can change the transposition, so this will transpose the sequence. So on the third page, if we select a note, we can know its velocity using the B knob. We can change the on timing and off timing. So this is micro timing. The sequencer is capable of recording notes between the steps. Despite the fact it's a step sequencer, we can still capture the subtlety of playing. So the fourth page on the sequencer is all about how the sequence is going to be captured when it's recorded. With tied notes on, we can record sustained notes, that is long notes. With it switched off, it'll just record staccato notes. We can choose whether we want to capture the micro timing or not. We also have the option to enter steps into the sequence in non-real time. That's what this auto step feature is for. I'll come back to that in a minute. So let's select an empty pattern. We can do this just by cycling through. Till we get to pattern 10, that will be empty by default, and it's set to 16 steps. I'm going to leave micro timing recording switched on for a minute. I'm going to go to the metronome and just turn that on. So raising the volume with A will make it beep, and then I'm going to turn on pre-count as well, which will give us a count in when we hit record. So from the sequencer screen, pressing X will take us in and out of record mode. You can see that noted at the bottom of the screen. So with the pattern button lit red, when we press record, it will give us a count in, and then we can record something. So there you go, you can hear that's been captured, including all my incredibly sloppy timing. So if I select one of these notes and go to the third page, you can see my marker timing there. So I'm like 28% early. So I can tweak that if we want to. I can bring that back to the center, or I can push it further. So if we bring that to 0, that should be bang on time. If we don't like the sequence we've recorded, we can hold clear and press the pattern play button, and that will delete the sequence. So let's try something with the micro timing switched off. As you can hear, that's much more rigid, it's not capturing any of the micro timing. So if we decide we want to keep this sequence with the pattern button selected, just press save, and it'll ask you where you want to save it. You can change this if you want to, but I'm just going to save in the current slot. So let's load a new pattern, and we can do something that's non-real-time recorded. So what we can do is we can go into record mode again. The pattern play button will light up, but this time we can just play notes into the sequence, and they will be captured on the grid. And then we can move the cursor around and add more notes in. But if we turn on the auto step feature that we talked about earlier, that is going to add notes and then move the cursor automatically. Don't know what that's going to sound like. Let's try it. Anytime we've got record selected, we can add and remove notes from the sequence. So say this first row here, I played the C with record on, I can take it out again and put it back in. So that's one way you can delete notes. You can also move the cursor over to them and press the clear button, and that will get rid of them. One thing to be aware of is that if you move back out of the sequencer screen and you've got record selected, you can hear that every other note is being heard. That's because notes are being added and removed from the sequence, despite the fact that we're not looking at the sequencer screen. So I've saved that pattern too, just to demonstrate pattern playback. So as we play a pattern back, we can select another one. The current pattern will wait until it's finished before triggering the new pattern. You don't have to be looking at the pattern screen to do this. I can tweak this filter, for example, and change patterns as long as I've got the pattern button selected. Obviously, we can also use the pattern seeker for drum sequences, so I've just loaded in a reggaeton kit and I've made this pattern. Because it's time to start talking about the looper. We don't need to be on any particular page to use the looper. The buttons will change colour depending on what's recorded into them, and also the strip across the bottom will show their contents. But if we go to the mixer, we can go backwards and forwards between the mixer view and the looper settings view. There's quite a few settings to go over in here, but just very quickly, if I hit one of the looper buttons, it will arm for recording, it will wait to the start of the bar, and then when I press it again, it will stop recording. That's because our looper tracks are currently set to free record. So if I play this pattern and then hit this, that records that audio from that pattern down into this loop. So now it's changed blue to tell us there's some contents here. So we can press it and we can hear that. But it's not coming from this pattern, that's coming from the audio. As you can see, that pattern's no longer playing. If we play a loop track and then press it again, it'll turn orange. This means we can add overdubs. So let's do that. So we can build up things that way if we want to. If we don't like the last thing we recorded, we can go to either the mixer or the loop settings and press the Y button. This will undo the last recording. Using the All button will stop anything that's playing, including the pattern. Anytime we want to save the contents of our looper, just make sure the loop button's pressed and then press save. We can choose a slot. I'm just going to press OK, and that will slave it into slot 0. So if we were to change the selection now to a different save and then go back, it's going to recover this. This saves the contents of the loop settings. It also saves the contents of the mixer. It also saves the BPM. So we had the BPM set to 120 when we recorded this. If we decide to change this now, this won't match. So despite the fact that we've changed our setting to 110 BPM, this will still play at 120. But it will still loop seamlessly. So if I decided I want to record this pattern a bit slower, I'd have to erase the contents of this looper track. So to do that, I can clear it by holding clear and pressing that button, and then just re-record it. So just to go over a few other looper settings, if we go to the mixer and press X, the top selection tells the ELZ1 play how we want to record our loops. which I'll get back to in a minute. If we scroll down a notch, we've got the direction that this plays in. So we can turn reverse on and off. So if I turn reverse on, it's going to play that backwards. I can decide how I want the loop to be played. So at the moment, playing it back will loop like normal. I can change it to gate. So when I press the button, it will play for however long I'm holding my finger down. We also have latch, which will just play the sequence once. So we recorded our drums in free mode. So the looper started recording once it latched onto the first beat. We can do that with some other material too. So this is another sound I've chosen. So I can let the beat run and then hit the second looper track and then record something. So that loop automatically started at the start of the bar, and that's where our recording started. But if we clear this and we put this into auto mode, for example, when we listen to the drums for 2 bars and then press looper 2, it's going to add that gap onto the start. So that's just a different way of doing things. This sound has some delay on it. You may notice that's getting chopped off when the looper recording stops. We can do something about that. I'm just going to put this back on free. I'm going to go down to this selection at the bottom. I'm going to move the B knob from record play to record overdub. So once the looper stops, it will automatically go into overdub mode. This will mean that delays will be captured on the start of the loop. So as you can hear, those delays have been captured as the loops wrap round. This is especially useful when we set the number of measures we want to record to at the top. So at the top, we can go 1 measure or 2 measures, for example. Let's pick 2. So if I start this recording and start this recording, I can just let it loop then. So we can predetermine how long we want things to last for before we start recording. Sometimes that makes it a bit easier. Let's just clear that though, because there's a bit more to talk about the auto mode. So if I record something in auto mode, it'll save that gap at the start, and then any other track set to auto will match the length that we've recorded. So let's record something in auto mode. So I've chosen another sound, and if I start these loops playing and then press record on looper 3, it will match the length of looper 2 because they're both set to auto. So I've had another stab at that and just come up with something a little bit more musically interesting because I want to record something else onto track 4. We don't just have to record internal sounds, we can record external sounds too. So I've got this external synth set up through the auxiliary in, and I can just use it like anything else. So I've got this track set to 4 bars. I'm going to hit all to play these, record, set this going. Then I could just play something in from the external source. So there are a number of playback options once we've got things into our looper. Obviously we can press the all button to play them all at once. We can play one track. If we want to stop that track, we press function and the track number. And that will stop it. Alternatively, we can mute tracks as they're playing. That's done by holding the mute button and pressing the track number. You may notice the mix is a bit off, so we can fix that. If we go back into the mixer view, we can adjust the track level from here. So the second row down, adjust the level. So I'll just set it going, give these a bit of a tweak. On the top row, we can adjust their panning. Below track level is the mute setting for each of the tracks. This is a match for when we hold mute and press the track buttons. And using the value knob, adjust the master level. Also in the mixer, there are some settings for external inputs and the internal synthesizer. So we can also accept audio over USB, so that's shown here, as well as the auxiliary. So we can change where the external inputs enter the effects chain. It's set to delay by default, so it'll go through the delay, then the reverb. Or we can just choose it to send through the reverb. If we scroll down, we can choose the send level for those effects. We can choose the panning for the external inputs and the synthesizer. We can choose the level for the external inputs and the synthesizer too. And then there are a number of mute options at the bottom, so we can mute the auxiliary, USB and synthesizer. We also can set the external input to dual mono, so then another controller appears on the B knob where we can set the level and send for left and right inputs respectively. So once you've finished recording and set up your mix, don't forget to save it. Select loop, press save, press OK. Even with all the loops full though, remember you can go back to the synthesizer and play either a sequence or a sound over the top of it for a performance. So there's just a few more things to talk about. As with lots of other SONICWARE devices, holding OK and playing notes will add them to a held stack. So we can press OK and play a key. Then play it again to get it to release. Or we can add more notes. And then play other keys freely. And then still release notes from that stack and leave the other ones playing. Anytime we want to clear the whole stack, hold clear and press OK. So just to go over the contents of the menu quickly, if you press the menu button, go into memory for example, select patch. From here we can initialize, export and import our patches. We can do the same thing from the pattern and looper menus. The wave data covers recorded audio and also custom waveforms. So the DNA and SiGrinder waveforms, the wave data 2 that we recorded earlier. From here we can import and export them. So if I wanted to copy that to the SD card, I'd do that from here. And the same is true of any custom waveforms we've made either in the wave memory synth or the FM mode. We've got a MIDI menu here where we can set up channels for the synthesizer, but also channels to receive MIDI for the different looper tracks and auxiliary settings. This is detailed really well in the MIDI implementation chart. We can change the out to a through. We can select the clock out from MIDI here too. The next selection down in the menu is our clock setting. We can set the source from being internal to look for an external MIDI clock, to look for sync in over the sync sockets or even the auxiliary in. This is useful if you want to hook up a pocket operator. We can also set the audio sync output as well. So again, if we want to send audio sync out to a pocket operator, we can switch it on here. There's a few settings in the keyboard menu. We can change the velocity curve here from curves 1 to 10, and the other way we can set a fixed value. We can also choose whether the keyboard gets transposed here too. We've got settings for auxiliary in. This is a match for what we just looked at in the mixer. So we can set it to stereo or dual mono. If it's in dual mono, you get 2 gain inputs, and then we've got pan left and right too for the auxiliary in. We've got a master tune. We can tune the whole device. So if the patch is set to global tuning, this will affect it. We can manage our SD card from here, including turning it into an SD card reader. So if we go into USB storage mode, once this is connected to the computer, we'll be able to see the contents of the SD card. We can delete, backup, and format the card from here. We can change the LCD brightness. So I've got mine set to 10. We can adjust that brightness here. We can change the auto power off. I've got mine turned off, but we can select different times that we want it to switch off due to inactivity. We can change the battery type. I tend to use nickel metal hydride batteries, so I'm going to select that. The output of different types of batteries are different, so we need to tell the ELZ1 Play which batteries we're using so it knows how to calibrate the battery meter. We can reset everything from here, which I don't want to do. And then we've got a thanks menu, which has the names of backers in it, which is nice. And then the system information below will show you what firmware version you're using. So if you want to upgrade your firmware, just hold the oscillator button down while you're turning on the device, and a boot menu will appear. The top option allows us to boot straight into the ELZ1. The second option down is our system update, so press OK. It will scan the SD card looking for an update file, and if it's found one, we can press OK. And this will erase the system and reinstall a new firmware. After a minute or so, it'll just ask us to restart, so we just need to power off and on again. So I think that about covers everything for this tutorial. Please let me know in the comments below if there's anything I missed, you just want clarifying. It's been quite a mammoth one. So thanks very much for watching, and please like and subscribe and all that stuff, and I'll catch you soon. Cheers.